Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulihi al-Kareem wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. So inshallah ta'ala, now we continue in Kitab al-Iman. We're actually getting very close to the end of the book of faith, Kitab al-Iman. Those of you that have been taking notes will be able to make a lot of connections inshallah ta'ala. So this is the advantage of note-taking. You'll start to connect a lot of concepts in these ahadith. Remember, the purpose of Sahih al-Bukhari is to study these ahadith not in isolation, but rather to study them together to deliver a series of points. And so when we're talking about Kitab al-Iman, we're talking about faith, which is obviously the most important aspect of Islam, then we have to be able to connect these ahadith inshallah ta'ala. So the name of the chapter today is Bab az-Zakatu min al-Islam. The chapter that to pay zakat is a part of Islam. وَقَوْلُهُ وَمَا أُمِرُوا إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُوا اللَّهَ مُخْلِصِينَ لَهُ الدِّينَ حُنَفَاءَ وَيُقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةَ وَيُؤْتُوا الزَّكَاةَ وَذَلِكَ دِينُ الْقَيِّمَةِ He mentions the ayah from Surah Al-Bayyinah where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and they were not commanded except to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sincerely, not associating any partners with Him, upholding the prayer, and also the zakah, also the obligatory charity, وَذَلِكَ دِينُ الْقَيِّمَةِ And that is indeed the straight, the correct path. Now, why would Al-Bukhari rahimahullah use this ayah to prove his points? He's trying to show that zakah has the same manzil, has the same station as salah. Zakah is a pillar of Islam, just like prayer is a pillar of Islam. Why? Because, obviously a group arose in the time of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, and they claimed that zakah no longer had to be paid since the Prophet ﷺ passed away. Okay, so zakah was only an institution that was limited to the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Once the Prophet ﷺ passes away, that's no longer there. That was the claim of this group. And obviously Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, he fought that, and he said that I will fight anyone who makes a distinction between salah and zakah, between prayer and zakah. So the point of this ayah being here, Al-Bukhari rahimahullah often uses these subheadings, is to show that zakah has the same station as salah, in the sense that it is also a pillar of Islam, and it's also extremely important, and to omit it, or to deny its obligation, is actually a form of disbelief. Now the hadith we're going to talk about has very little to do with zakah. But again, a hadith will be quoted by Al-Bukhari multiple times, okay, to make the point that he's trying to make. So the hadith that we study is not necessarily connected to zakah, but it's actually a much bigger issue inshallah ta'ala. So the hadith says basically that, and this is narrated, that Talha ibn Ubaidillah radiyallahu anhu, he says, جاء رجل إلى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم من أهل نجد, that a man came to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam from the people of Najd. Now Najd, there's a modern day area that's around Riyadh which is named Najd as a city, a modern day location. But Najd actually historically referred to 12 or 13 different locations. So Najd can mean many things, but what it always means is somewhere to the east. So Najd can be from the direction of Iraq all the way to Medina, somewhere to the east, that a man came to the Prophet ﷺ from that area. And the idea of this hadith is to convey first and foremost that this man was a foreigner, he was an out-of-towner. He was a Bedouin from far away, he would have a different accent, he wasn't accustomed to the ways of the Prophet ﷺ and the companions quite yet. So he came to the Prophet ﷺ. ثَائِرُ الرَّأْسِ يُسْمَعُ دَوِيُّ صَوْتِهِ وَلَا يُفْقَهُ مَا يَقُولُ حَتَّى دَنَا فَإِذَا هُوَ يَسْأَلُ عَنِ الْإِسْلَامِ. So the hadith says that this man, when he came, and it's very particular language, the companion said we could hear his loud voice, but we couldn't understand what he was saying. Meaning he was speaking extremely loud, but we couldn't understand what he was saying until he came very, very close. Then we came to know that he was asking about Islam. Now what happens when someone speaks in a language or they're trying to convey something to you and you're not understanding them, what do they tend to do? Out of frustration, they tend to speak louder, right? So the companions are saying this guy came in his accent, or the way that he was speaking, his dialect, was so different to them that they didn't understand what he was saying. So he kept on raising his voice, as if that makes it better, right? We do that all the time. You raise your voice. And we couldn't understand what he was saying until he came near and then we made out from his language that he was asking about Islam. Okay? This is just to convey to you the full story, the incident. So the Prophet ﷺ, فقال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم خمس صلوات في اليوم والليلة, that they are 5 prayers in the day and the night. فقال هل علي غيرها? The man said, do I have to do anything other than those 5 prayers? فقال عليه الصلاة والسلام لا إلا أن تتطوع. The Prophet ﷺ said, no, unless you want to do extra, unless you want to do more. قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وصيام رمضان. And then the Prophet ﷺ said, and the fasting of Ramadan. So the man said, هل علي غيره? Do I have to do more than the fasting of Ramadan? The Prophet ﷺ said, no, لا إلا أن تتطوع, unless you decide to do extra. قال وذكر له رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم الزكاة. The Prophet ﷺ then mentioned to him zakah. He taught him about the zakah. قال هل علي غيرها? The man said, do I have to do anything other than the zakah? قال لا إلا أن تتطوع. The Prophet ﷺ said, no, unless you want to do extra. قال فأدبر الرجل وهو يقول والله لا أزيد على هذا ولا أنقص. So the man turned away from the Prophet ﷺ. As he turned away from the Prophet ﷺ, he was saying out loud, I swear by Allah, لا أزيد على هذا ولا أنقص, I will not do anything more or anything less than this. قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أفلح إن صدق. The Prophet ﷺ said, he will succeed if he is truthful. He will gain his salvation if he is truthful in what he was saying. Very interesting hadith. Now let's dissect it, inshallah. So he said the man was from the east, he's from a strange town, or he's from a town that's not, very close to Medina. A very different dialect. He's a Bedouin. It's very clear that he's not the most educated man, right? He's a very simple man coming to the Prophet ﷺ to ask the Prophet ﷺ some questions. Al-Khattabi rahimahullah ta'ala, he said, taking into consideration that the meaning of the narrations and so on and so forth, he said that the man had a loud voice, and when the people, clearly couldn't understand him, he raised his voice louder, okay? And, he was calling from far away, which was making it even more difficult. So finally, when he sat down, when he lowered his voice, when he was clear in trying to, or when he was expressing himself in a clearer fashion, then it was understood by the companions that he's asking about Islam. Now, for those of you that take notes, all right, Allahu Alam, but the research seems to indicate that this man, his name is Jazam ibn Battal. Jazam ibn Battal. The reason why this is important is because this narration is conflated often with another narration which is very simple, which is very similar, and the name of the companion in that narration is Dhimam ibn Tha'laba, and I'm going to go over that narration. So he's often, this narration is very similar to another incident that happened with the Prophet ﷺ. That man's name was Dhimam ibn Tha'laba, and some of the commentators of Hadith, they say that this incident is talking about Dhimam, but it doesn't make sense for a few reasons, which I'll mention inshallah ta'ala. So the man's name, Allahu Alam, is Jazam ibn Battal radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. يسأل عن الإسلام. He came to the Prophet ﷺ asking him about Islam. So he's asking the Prophet ﷺ some of the basics about Islam, some of the proofs about Islam, some of the hujaj about Islam, the evidences and so on and so forth. And the Prophet ﷺ had a conversation with him. The man accepted it. The man said, okay, fine. This makes sense. I'll become Muslim. So it's a very quick conversation. It's not, the man is not really, he doesn't need much to be convinced of Islam. He's a very simple man. Tawheed makes sense to him. Monotheism makes sense to him. And other narrations, this narration, by the way, is in Muslim. It's in Al-Muwatta of Imam Malik and others. Say this man had unkempt hair. He had rough clothes. That this was a very simple man. So immediately he accepted. So he said to the Prophet ﷺ, okay, what do I have to do now? What do I have to do? All right, fine. Makes sense. Now what do I have to do? And the Prophet ﷺ said, 5 prayers in the day and in the night. Now here's the thing. Are there only 5 obligatory prayers in Islam? Wow. God. Yes. It's okay, guys, answer. You're like, wait, that's a trick question. I know there's a 6th one. I heard a sheikh say it. No, there's 5 daily prayers in Islam, right? 5 obligatory prayers. But then there's debate over some of the other prayers about whether or not they're emphasized to a point of obligation. Who can give me an example of that? Witr. So is witr emphasized to a point of obligation? Are the 2 rak'ahs before Fajr emphasized to a point of obligation? If so, is the obligation the same as the obligation of the 5 prayers? Now obviously, different schools of fiqh deal with this in different ways. So in the Hanafi school, there are different levels of wajib. There are things that are more obligatory than others, but they're still obligatory. And there are different levels of dislike. Okay? So even within makruh, there are things that are makruh, that are disliked to a point of being prohibited. The other schools don't necessarily have that system, but still, some of the scholars would say that to insist upon missing witr, like to insist upon it, to never pray witr, or to never pray the 2 rak'ahs before Fajr, the Sunan of Fajr, which the Prophet ﷺ would pray even when he traveled, would make a person sinful. Allahu A'lam, but I mean, this hadith is used as proof by those who say that, in fact, that there is nothing that is sinful to miss other than the 5 daily prayers. To insist upon missing some of the other prayers could make you sinful, but that's a fiqhi discussion. But generally speaking, there is nothing that is mandatory, obligatory, that a person would be punished for missing other than the 5 daily prayers. All right, and this is a proof for that, that the Prophet ﷺ did not mention anything but these 5 prayers. Then the Prophet ﷺ mentioned to him the fasting of Ramadan. Now, Ramadan was legislated, the Siyam of Ramadan was legislated in the 2nd year after Hijrah. Fasting was made mandatory before that. كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الصِّيَامُ كَمَا كُتِبَ عَلَى الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ. The ayah in Surah Al-Baqarah where fasting was made mandatory was أَيَّامًا مَعْدُودَات, was a few days. Okay? So the day of Ashura was made mandatory. The day of Arafah, some of the scholars say, was made mandatory, and possibly some other days, they were made mandatory to fast. Alright? And basically you had a choice with those days, and that was that you could either fast them or you could give charity. You could feed a poor person. So whether you were sick or healthy, whatever it may be, you could take the day of Ashura off, even when Ashura was mandatory, and you could give sadaqah instead. You could feed a poor person instead, and that would count in lieu of that fasting. When Ramadan came, those days became voluntary. And obviously with the days of Ramadan, you have to fast the days of Ramadan unless you have an excuse. So the mandatory fasting of Ramadan came in the 2nd year after Hijrah. Then came as zakah. Okay? Now zakah is really interesting because Bukhari puts this hadith here to prove the legislation of zakah, to prove that zakah is a part of faith. Zakah is a part of Islam. Now when was zakah legislated as an institution? And I want to be very clear here that I'm saying zakah as an institution because there was a concept of zakah before there was an institution of zakah. Okay, and I'll explain what that means. Zakah, as we know it, 2.5%, the categories of zakah, the percentages of zakah, what's considered zakatable of your wealth, who you can give it to, who's exempt, and so on and so forth. This entire system, collecting zakah, and giving it out and distributing it, this did not come obviously until Medina. Alright? And it's either the 1st or the 2nd year after Hijrah. Some of the scholars say the 1st year after Hijrah, some say the 2nd year after Hijrah. The Prophet ﷺ started to collect zakah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed all of the laws and regulations about zakah. Some scholars, like Imam Ibn Khuzaymah rahimahullah ta'ala, they actually say zakah was already legislated as an institution in Mecca. But that's a very minor opinion. Now, there is one thing that makes it very interesting though. The word zakah, and the concept of zakah is referenced even in Makki Quran. Not only is the concept of zakah referenced in Makki Quran, in Quran that was revealed before Medina, but it's even referenced as an obligation. Okay? Now the word zakah means what? It means to purify, like tazkiyah, to purify and to grow. You purify something and you let it grow. So zakah means to purify your wealth, right? So naturally there are some things that have come into your wealth that could have been haram and so on and so forth, some things of shubha, of doubtfulness. You give zakah, you purify your wealth, you put barakah in your wealth, you put blessing in your wealth, and so on and so forth. So the meaning of zakah is that. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala spoke about zakah in Mecca, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala spoke about it in the general sense of charity. Okay, so when zakah is referenced in Mecca, it's referred to in the general sense of charity. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala went so far to even obligate the believers to give charity in Mecca, without percentages, without who to give charity to, but just this concept of prayer and zakah became mandatory in Mecca. So for example, in Surah Al-Fussilat, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, in the 7th verse, الَّذِينَ لَا يُؤْتُونَ الزَّكَاةَ وَهُمْ بِالْآخِرَةِ هُمْ كَافِرُونَ. Allah actually threatens the people who don't give charity, who don't give zakah. And the word zakah here means charity. Okay? And they are disbelievers. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is reprimanding people who turn away from this idea of charity, who turn away from giving charity. So the concept of charity was made mandatory upon the believers in late Mecca. So you guys going to follow me here? Early Mecca, zakah is referenced in the Quran as a general advice to give charity. Late Mecca, zakah is referenced in the Quran as a mandatory, as a command, as something that is mandatory to give, but still with no definitions, no parameters. You just have to give charity at that point. Alright? Early Medina, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals all of the laws in regards to zakah as an institution. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam establishes it as an institution. So everything pertaining to zakah as far as percentages and parameters and so on and so forth, that came in early Medina. And Imam Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah says, and this is to, how much is zakah? Okay, good. You sure it's not 2.7%? Positive? Alright, good. 2.5%. Okay? Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah says, and you might remember when we talked about this hadith, أَحَبُّ الدِّينِ إِلَى اللَّهِ al-Hanifiyatu Samha, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, where the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned the most beloved parts of the religion, or the most beloved of religions, are those that are in accordance with the way of Ibrahim alayhi salam, and they're lenient, they're very easy. Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah said every prophet came with an institution of zakah, some form of charity, some form of mandatory charity for those that followed him. But that which was legislated through the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was the easiest. It is the absolute easiest. Alright? Now if you guys remember, when we talked about that hadith that I just mentioned in brief, we said that the reason why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made this religion so easy is what? If Allah would have made zakat 10%, do you think the companions would have said, Ya Rasulullah, 10% is a little too much, can you make it 5? Why did Allah make it so easy? I mean, you have a generation of people that give all of their wealth for the sake of Allah. Some give half of their wealth. Why? It's a percentage?
The more you make, the more saving you have, the more you can give.
What's that?
Because greedy people like us who come after?
Because greedy people like us who come after? You're coming close. I think you have the answer, yeah.
So it can work for everybody who comes.
Barakallahu fikum. The legislation of Islam, because the Prophet ﷺ is the last prophet and is a universal prophet, and his legislation will last until the end of time, the legislation of Islam was sent in such a way that it could accommodate even the most wicked generations that come later. It was made easy enough that anyone coming 1,000 years later would still be able to apply it. Because had Allah revealed 50 prayers and 10% zakat and so on and so forth upon the generation of the Prophet ﷺ, very few people would have actually objected to that. So 2.5% is actually a very, very easy number, And not only that, but you have to have nisab. You have to have a certain threshold of money that you yourself possess. Otherwise, you yourself are eligible for charity. Right? It's actually a very beautiful system. It's a very simple system. And it's distributed amongst the poor of that society. So it's circulated amongst the poor of that society. It doesn't disappear. Amongst the priests, and so on and so forth, this concept of a religious elite class, where you never see the money again. You see the effect of zakat in your society. So it's pretty good. Okay, it's pretty easy. And you don't find many companions complaining about zakat. It's so easy, in fact, that a lot of Muslims forget to pay it. Right? It's like, well, did I meet nisab this year? Oh my God, I think I did. I think I hit that threshold, right? And it's not that much money, so you say, well, I give charity anyway. But it doesn't work that way. You have to have a hawd, you have to have a date of the year, you have to have a percentage and so on and so forth. It's a part of your faith, it's a part of your religion, and so on and so forth. Okay? So the Prophet ﷺ gave these three things. The man said, I'm not going to increase, I'm not going to do any more, I'm not going to do less, and that's it. And the Prophet ﷺ says, if he does that, then he has Jannah. Is something missing from this hadith? Hajj. What else is missing from this hadith? Shahada. Good. So the first and the last pillar of Islam are missing. Shahada is assumed. Okay, in the hadith that the man obviously took Shahada, he obviously became Muslim. Why is Hajj missing? Hajj was not legislated until what year? The 9th year after Hijrah. Hajj was not legislated until the 9th year after Hijrah. Okay, so Hajj is the last of the 5 pillars that was legislated. So this is clearly frozen in time. This incident takes place clearly before the legislation of Hajj. Now here's the thing. The Prophet ﷺ, when he would ask, he said, look, do I have to do more than 5 prayers? The Prophet ﷺ told him, only if you want to do tatawwur, if you want to do more, you want to do extra. Okay? So this brings up a really interesting discussion, right? And we already kind of touched on it. This idea of, is it enough to just do the fard and move on? Is it enough to just do the mandatory things? Are there other things in Islam that are also mandatory? And to do a mandatory action, do you have to complete that mandatory action? All of this is actually discussed in great length by the ulama, by the scholars. What we find is that, number one, when it comes to a nafil, when it comes to a voluntary deed, just because it's legislated, in fact, even if it's emphasized, a person is not sinful for not doing them. You will not be punished for not doing them. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ, for example, he used to intend fasting on a certain day. So there's a day, let's say it's a Monday or a Thursday. It's the habit of the Prophet ﷺ to fast. Or the middle 3 days of the month. Or a day that the Prophet ﷺ just wants to fast. There are times that the Prophet ﷺ intended to fast, and then the Prophet ﷺ broke his fast midway through the day. And there's no penalty, there's no ithm, because it was a voluntary fast. Also with Juwayriyah radiallahu ta'ala anha. The Prophet ﷺ actually told her to break her fast one day. It was a Friday. And she had to pay no penalty. There was nothing to be made up for because it was a voluntary action. So the proof of that, as Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala points out, is that just because an act is legislated, even if it's emphasized, doesn't mean that it's sinful to omit or to break, okay, even halfway. Whereas a fard fast, for example, you have to make it up. There are severe penalties and expiations in terms of making up and so on and so forth, depending on what you did to break that fast. Hajj as well, okay? There are certain things, once you're in Hajj and you're in the middle of it, then there are penalties to be observed if you intentionally miss something or omitted something, because it's something that's followed. Alright? So when it comes to these things, it's important to note that the Prophet ﷺ is making it very clear that it starts with the fara'id. It starts with the mandatory things. We also see that the Prophet ﷺ did not mention to this man the details of zakah or the details of salah. So he didn't tell, it's not like, okay, 5 prayers a day, now be on your way. Zakah, just do zakah, just be on your way. But this man obviously would have to have someone teach him. Now something very beautiful is and we can learn this when we deal with converts, alright, in particular, when someone comes and takes shahada, you don't just celebrate and let them go. Okay? When someone would come to the Prophet ﷺ and accept Islam, the Prophet ﷺ would assign someone to teach him, or assign a group of people to teach him. Alright? So there was a follow-up procedure there. So this is just the initial conversation between the Prophet ﷺ and this man, that this is what you have to do. Do you agree to this in concept? Alright? If yes, then here's how you're going to do it. So then the Prophet ﷺ would send, he would dispatch, usually one of the companions, if it was someone that came from a land where there weren't many Muslims, he would send a companion to spend some time with that man before he sent him back. If the man belonged to a certain group of people that were already Muslim, then the Prophet ﷺ would instruct those people in the area where that man resides or that woman resides to teach them the religion, to stay with them and to teach them the religion. So we actually have a follow-up, the follow-up to the convert or to the revert is actually already implied. Okay? Now let's go into some of the intricacies of this narration. In one narration, the man said to the Prophet ﷺ, وَالَّذِي أَكْرَمَكَ, He swore by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the one who made you noble, the one who bestowed his generosity, his benevolence upon you. So the man was not being disrespectful to the Prophet ﷺ. He wasn't turning away from the Prophet ﷺ and saying, I'm not going to do more, I'm not going to do any less, like, now you have to give me Jannah. He's saying it as in, okay, this religion, this isn't too hard. This is something I can handle. So I can do this. I can master this. I can stick to this. Okay? So he was not being rude to the Prophet ﷺ when he says that. Because if you read this narration in a certain way, it almost comes off as rude. I'm not going to do anything more than that, and I'm not going to do any less. But he's saying, وَالَّذِي أَكْرَمَكَ, by the one who bestowed his generosity, his benevolence upon you. Now in Sahih Muslim, this hadith has another intricacy. This hadith has a very interesting wording, or in some of the other narrations where the Prophet ﷺ says, أَفْلَحَ وَأَبِيهِ إِن صَدَقَ. أَفْلَحَ وَأَبِيهِ إِن صَدَقَ. He has succeeded by his father if he is truthful. Now here's the problem. Alright? Is it permissible to swear by anything or anyone other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? No. You can't. The Prophet ﷺ says, لا تحلفوا بآبائكم. Don't swear by your fathers. The Prophet ﷺ even called it a form of shirk and kufr. He called it a form of disbelief and polytheism. People used to swear by their fathers, they used to swear by their tribes, and so on and so forth. So how do we explain then the Prophet ﷺ swearing by the man's father? How do we explain it? What do you guys think? Think about some of the things we already covered. Okay? The easiest explanation, and the one that makes the most sense, is that the prohibition was not there yet. The tahreem was still not there. The prohibition was not there. And this is why studying hadith, sciences and understanding, the chronological order and which hadith came before the other and so on and so forth is so important. This hadith cannot be used as evidence that it's okay to swear by someone or something other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because this is a very early hadith in Islam. It's already implied in the way that the narration is taking place. So the easiest explanation and the strongest explanation is that the Prophet ﷺ, did this before the prohibition came. And when the Prophet ﷺ said it, he wasn't implying shirk. The Prophet ﷺ was doing what the people did to show them the seriousness, the gravity of the affair. Because when the Arabs used to get serious about something, they would swear by their fathers. They would take oaths by their fathers. Okay, so the Prophet ﷺ was actually showing them, look, this man, if he does this, then he will certainly succeed. He will attain salvation on the Day of Judgment. So the discussion, is it enough to just do fard then? Is it enough to just be an average Muslim? Is it enough to just pray 5 prayers? To say, you know what, I'm never going to do Taraweeh, I'm never going to pray Witr, I'm never going to pray the Sunnah of Fajr, and so on and so forth. Is that enough for me to get to Jannah? Alright? What do you guys think? Yes. So no more Sunnah. No more fundraisers. Just pay your zakah. No more fasting the 6 days of Shawwal. No more Mondays and Thursdays. No more, none of that. Khalas, let's go home. أقول قولي هذا. Is that it? Is the religion done? How do we contextualize this hadith? Yeah. Because it does depend indeed on the quality of the actions as well. The Prophet ﷺ says, you will have from your prayer that which you were attentive in. Okay? So it depends on the quality of your deeds as well. Now here's what we're asked to do. Here's how we answer this question. At the end of the day, the demand from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon us is to do that which He obligated us to do. Okay? To follow the fara'id. And to stay away from the things that He prohibited. That's the bare minimum, right? To be a Muslim or to be a practicing Muslim, if that word even applies here, you have to do that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala obligated you to do, and you have to stay away from, especially the kaba'ir, the major sins, al-fawahish, okay? The major sins that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told you to stay away from. But here's a very important concept in the religion, okay? Pay attention, very, very, very close attention. The primary purpose of the nawafil, the primary purpose of voluntary actions is to do what? is to cover up for our deficiencies within our obligatory actions. The primary purpose of the voluntary deeds is to cover up for the inevitable deficiencies within our obligatory actions. So when the man says, La azidu wa la anqus, that I want to do more, I want to do less, that implies that he's going to do the fara'id perfectly. He will do the mandatory things perfectly. So yes, when the Prophet ﷺ says, in sadaq, aflah in sadaq, that if he's telling the truth, then he will indeed succeed and he will enter into Jannah. But we will inevitably fall short in our prayers, in our fasting, in our zakah, so on and so forth. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us these voluntary deeds first and foremost to fill it in. What's the proof of that? It's a hadith in Abu Dawood and a Tirmidhi, where the Prophet ﷺ said, the first thing you'll be asked about on the Day of Judgment is your salah. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees deficiencies in your salah, Allah will ask, are there any voluntary prayers that this person did? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will take those voluntary prayers and Allah will patch up your prayers. Until He's completely patched up your prayers and there remains no more deficiency, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will move on to your fasting. And when Allah sees deficiencies in your fasting, okay, that you shouldn't have been saying certain things, that you looked at certain things that you shouldn't have looked at, that you failed spiritually in some of those fasting, or in some of those fasts, or you even failed, in meeting the obligation in some ways, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks, are there any voluntary fasts? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will patch up your fasting with those voluntary fasts. And the Prophet ﷺ says that Allah will do that with sa'irul a'mal, with all of your deeds. So the primary reason for the existence of voluntary good deeds, defined voluntary good deeds, by the way. Think about that from if you studied religion, this is a very foreign concept. Okay? Not only do you have very defined fara'id, very defined obligatory actions, but even the voluntary deeds are very much so defined. And we talked about this concept of how Islam is so defined last week. Even your voluntary deeds are defined. You want to make up for your salah, you want to make up for your fard, you want to fill in the deficiencies, pray these 2 rak'ahs. Fill them in. Okay? And what we find is that, these rak'ahs, inshallah ta'ala, will take care of the fard rak'ahs as well, because we will inevitably fall. Alright? So the voluntary deeds are there to first and foremost cover up the deficiencies, and then, of course, to bring us closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The primary purpose of avoiding all sin is that it distances us from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and all sins can become major sins if you insist on them. So what makes a sin, at the end of the day, a kabira, a major sin, any sin, a major sin, is your insistence on that sin. So this is what we're being asked to do more than anything else. And then there's some other things that we see from the ulama. Some of the scholars said when the Prophet ﷺ says in sadaq, aflaha in sadaq, that he will succeed if he's telling the truth, they said that there is no way that a person succeeds in his fara'id, in his mandatory deeds, except that he will also succeed in his nawafil. He'll succeed in his voluntary prayers. So you got some people that will do the voluntary deeds to patch up for the mandatory ones, right? Which we should all be doing. But then you have some people that do the voluntary deeds. Why? Because they've tasted the sweetness of the mandatory deeds. So even if there was no deficiency in the fard, I would still pray more. Even if there was no deficiency in my fasting, even if I think I fasted Ramadan perfectly, I still love to fast because of how it brings me closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is in the very famous hadith Qudsi, وَمَا تَقَرَّبَ إِلَيَّ عَبْدِي بِشَيْءٍ أَحَبُّ إِلَيَّ مِمَّا افْتَرَضْتُهُ عَلَيْهِ. That my servant does not come close to me with anything more beloved to me than the things I've made mandatory on him. And then he continues to get close to me bin nawafil. He continues to draw closer to me with the voluntary deeds. So some of the scholars said, if you're given tawfiq, if you're able to master the fara'id, and you taste the sweetness in the mandatory things, you'll keep on going. So you automatically have implied success in the nawafil. Some of the scholars, they try to escape, obviously, the awkward thought here that that a Muslim could just pray 5 prayers and so on and so forth and not be punished. So At-Tlibi, rahimahullah ta'ala, Imam At-Tlibi, he said it could be that when the man said La azidu wa la anqus, that I won't increase and I won't decrease, he meant that I won't increase on the guidance of the Prophet ﷺ or decrease from the guidance of the Prophet ﷺ. Yani ala kalam an-Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, on the words of the Prophet ﷺ. So meaning this religion that you're giving, I'm not going to innovate and add anything, nor will I take anything away from it. But Ibn Hajar rahimahullah says that's escape. He's just trying to escape from the meaning of the hadith, because the Prophet ﷺ clearly used the words, unless you do tatawwu', unless you increase extra from yourself. So clearly what's being talked about here are the deeds, okay, are the different acts. And Imam al-Nawawi rahimahullah ta'ala, he also says that we can't say from this, for example, that everything that the Prophet ﷺ mentioned here is enough, because some people would actually argue then that Hajj is not necessary. Because the Prophet ﷺ said if he did what he was commanded to do, or if he did what he said he would do, he would have Jannah. Then can we say then that we don't need to do Hajj? Why? Because it wasn't legislated at the time. You guys see the connection with some of the previous ahadith we've covered? The religion being complete. Okay, al-yawma akmaltu lakum dinakum. We talked about this concept of how the religion was complete. So when Khadija radiallahu anha passed away and there still was no Hajj, no Zakah, no Ramadan, no nothing, no Janazah, right? Her religion was complete. She had perfect iman because she lived up to the standard of the time. So Nawawi rahimahullah says his success, his salvation is in doing what he was commanded to do. Our salvation is in doing what we are commanded to do at the time that it's been given to us. I just want to give you guys another narration, inshallah ta'ala, which is the story of Imam ibn Tha'laba. I said some scholars conflated this man's story, this man's narration, with the narration of Imam ibn Tha'laba. Imam ibn Tha'laba radiallahu anhu is a very, very beautiful companion. This is a very interesting story. Okay, he's a man from Banu Sa'id. Okay, and Banu Sa'id, Ibn Bakr was actually a tribe close to Ta'if. They lived around the area of Ta'if. So this is a man from the area close to Ta'if. Some of the scholars say he's from Shanu'ah, which is the same tribe that the Prophet ﷺ said resembled Musa alayhi salam, or Musa resembled the people of that tribe. So he's a Bedouin, he's from the Badia of Banu Sa'id, he lives close to Ta'if. He came to the Prophet ﷺ sometime after the 5th year after Hijrah. So the earliest narrations indicate that it was the 5th year. The latest narration is that it was Am al-Wufud, which is the year of the delegations, the 9th year after Hijrah, where the Prophet ﷺ received the various delegations. So sometime between the 5th and the 9th year after Hijrah, this man came, and this is narrated widely by various companions. He basically made a scene at the masjid. He came to the masjid. He tied his camel at the door of the masjid. And he walked into the masjid, and with a loud voice he says, Ayna ibn Abdul Muttalib? Where is the son of Abdul Muttalib? And he had his hair parted in different ways, unkempt hair, the same description of a Bedouin, right? Someone that's just from the desert, not really going to have all the courtesies and things of that sort. He walks into the masjid, ties his camel at the door, comes in. Where is the son of Abdul Muttalib? Okay, why did he call him the son of Abdul Muttalib? What do you guys think? Understand the culture of the Arabs, okay? Abdul Muttalib was the Sheikh of Quraysh, like he's the leader of Quraysh. So anyone who's a son of Abdul Muttalib, anyone who's a descendant of Abdul Muttalib would be called the son of Abdul Muttalib. Okay, the father of the Prophet ﷺ, Abdullah, actually didn't live very long. He didn't have much of a name within Quraysh. He didn't live a very long life anyway. He died very young. So Abdul Muttalib is who the Prophet ﷺ is famous for from a lineage perspective. So when he calls out, he says, Ayna ibn Abdul Muttalib? Where is the son of Abdul Muttalib? The Prophet ﷺ responded and says, Ana ibn Abdul Muttalib. I am the son of Abdul Muttalib. Okay? So the man walked up to him and he says, A Muhammad? Are you Muhammad? The Prophet ﷺ says yes. And the Prophet ﷺ kana muttaki'an, he was leaning down, and sometimes the Prophet ﷺ would lay down like this with the companions. He'd rest on his elbow, and he was kind of just, he was surrounded by the companions in the middle of the masjid, and the Prophet ﷺ was leaning down. He came up to him, he said, A Muhammad, are you Muhammad? The Prophet ﷺ says yes. So he said to him, he says, Ya ibn Abdul Muttalib, inni sa'iluka. He says, O son of Abdul Muttalib, I'm going to ask you some questions. وَمُغْلِظٌ عَلَيْكَ فِي الْمَسْأَلَةِ. He says, listen, I'm going to be pretty rough with the way I ask questions. There's not going to be much flowery language here. I'm not going to give you any courtesies. I'm not going to make it a speech. I'm going to ask you some very direct questions. فَلَا تَجِدَنَّ فِي نَفْسِكَ. Don't get offended. I'm not trying to be rude here. This is just the way I talk. Alright, I'm going to be very direct, to the point. No flowery language here. I'm going to ask you these questions, and this is just how I talk. The Prophet ﷺ says, لا أجد في نفسي فسل عما بدالك. The Prophet ﷺ says, listen, nothing's going to offend me. Just ask what's on your mind. Tell me what's on your mind. Go ahead, say it. You don't have to give me the whole list of, جئناك من فلان. No, you don't have to say we came from this area and so on and so forth to such an honorable son. Just go, start. So he said to the Prophet ﷺ, يا ابن عبد المطلب من رفع السماء. He said, O son of Abdul Muttalib, who raised the skies? The Prophet ﷺ is still leaning down. The Prophet ﷺ says, Allah. He says, وَمَنْ بَسَطَ الْأَرْض. Okay, who made the earth livable? Basat al-ard would mean made it livable, so that a person could traverse on it and so on and so forth. The Prophet ﷺ says, Allah. He said, وَمَنْ نَصَبَ الْجِبَالِ. He said, who pegged the mountains, placed the mountains as pegs? The Prophet ﷺ says, Allah. So he says, أَسْأَلُكَ بِمَنْ رَفَعَ السَّمَاءِ وَنَصَبَ الْجِبَالِ وَبَسَطَ الْأَرْضِ اللَّهُ بَعَثَكَ إِلَيْنَا رَسُولًا. He said, I'm asking you by the one who raised the skies and made the earth livable, flattened the earth in that sense, and pegged the mountains. Did Allah send you as a messenger to us? So he's asking him straight up, did Allah send you as a messenger? So the Prophet ﷺ, he sat up and he says to him, Allahumma na'am. By Allah, yes. By Allah, yes. And he goes through the same wording. I ask you by the one who raised the skies, and the one who leveled the earth, and the one who placed the mountains as pegs. Did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allahu amaraka an ta'murana bis salah? Did Allah command you to command us to pray? So the Prophet ﷺ says, Allahumma na'am. By Allah, yes. And then he said to the Prophet ﷺ the same thing. Did Allah command you to command us to fast? The Prophet ﷺ said yes. And he said, and did Allah command you to command us to give zakah? And the Prophet ﷺ said yes. And then he says, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa annaka Rasulullah. Wallahi la azidu ala ma sami'tu wa la anqus. Ana Dhiman ibn Tha'laba, akhu bani Sa'id ibn Bakr. He said to the Prophet ﷺ, he took shahada, and he said, I swear I will not increase upon anything that you told me. I won't say anything more than what I heard, and I won't decrease. Then he introduced himself. He didn't even introduce himself up to this point. He said, my name is Dhiman ibn Tha'laba, and I am the brother of Sa'id ibn Bakr, meaning I come from the tribe of, or the area of Sa'id ibn Bakr. Anas radiallahu anhu says that he left in such haste that he didn't even bother to untie his camel properly. So when he rode off, he kind of took something with him. Right? SubhanAllah, like he was in such a rush after that conversation with the Prophet ﷺ that he just left, he just took off. The Prophet ﷺ, he said to the companions who are obviously watching this incident, and just awe of the way that this conversation just unfolded before their eyes. The Prophet ﷺ says, أَفْلَحَ وَاللَّهِ إِن صَدَقَ مَنْ صَرَّهُ أَنْ يَنظُرَ إِلَى رَجُلٍ مِنْ أَهْلِ الْجَنَّةِ فَلْيَنظُرْ إِلَى هَذَا. Prophet ﷺ said, I swear by Allah, he will succeed if he's telling the truth. But then the Prophet ﷺ says, مَنْ صَرَّهُ أَنْ يَنظُرَ إِلَى رَجُلٍ مِنْ أَهْلِ الْجَنَّةِ. Whoever really wants to see a man from the people of Jannah, فَلْيَنظُرْ إِلَى هَذَا. Look at this man. SubhanAllah, the Prophet ﷺ شَهِدَ لَهُ بِالْجَنَّةِ. He testified that this man would enter into Jannah before the man prayed, before the man did anything. But the Prophet ﷺ saw the truthfulness in what Dhiman said. So Dhiman went riding back to his people, really, really, really quick. Then he called all of his people to him, and he started to curse Allat wal Uzza. So he started off by saying that Allat and Al-Uzza are worthless. Right? And so he's going off on their idols. So they said, Waylak, ittaqil baras, ittaqil junoon. He said, woe to you, fear Allah. Or they said, or be careful, you're going to get struck by leprosy, you're going to get struck by lightning, you're going to go crazy, all this terrible stuff's going to happen to you. Because you're talking about Allat wal Uzza. The Imam says, فَإِنَّهُمَا وَاللَّهِ لَا يَنْفَعَانِ وَلَا يَضُرَّانِ. He said, I swear by Allah, they do not benefit a person, nor do they harm a person. إِنَّ اللَّهَ قَدْ بَعَثَ رَسُولًا وَأَنزَلَ مَعَهُ كِتَابًا. That Allah has indeed sent a messenger and sent with him a book. to wake you up out of your ignorance. SubhanAllah. I mean, he's talking to them quite direct. And he says, وَإِنِّي أَشْهَدُ أَن لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ وَحْدَهُ لَا شَرِيكَ لَهُ. And I swear that there is only one God, that there is no deity worthy of worship except Allah. And He has no partners. وَأَشْهَدُ أَنَّ مُحَمَّدًا عَبْدُهُ وَرَسُولُهُ. And I swear that Muhammad is his slave and his messenger. وَقَدْ جِئْتُكُم مِّنْ عِنْدِهِ بِمَا أَمَرَكُم بِهِ وَنَهَاكُمْ عَنْهُ. And I have come to you from Him with the commands that He has given and the prohibitions that He has given. And, subhanAllah, by the time the sun sets, this is what Anas radiallahu anhu says, by the time the sun sets, there was not a single person in that entire valley except that the Imam argued with them and convinced them and they took Shahada. So in the same night, this simple man, subhanAllah, just argued with these people, showed them the worthlessness of their idols, and convinced them that Allah sent the Prophet ﷺ and that he was a messenger of the Prophet ﷺ. Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu used to say, فَمَا سَمِعْنَا بِوَافِدٍ قَدِمًا كَانَ أَفْضَلُ مِنْ الْإِمَامِ. We did not hear of a single delegate. We don't know of a single delegate. Because remember, delegations were sent. People were sent on behalf of their tribes. We do not know of anyone that came to the Prophet ﷺ that was better than the Imam. SubhanAllah, this man is a great companion. Even though he's a very simple man, but he got it. So some of the scholars, they mix up this narration with the narration of the man from Najd, which we mentioned, which we talked about today. When did this happen with the Imam? Most of the books will say it's in Am al-Wufud, the 9th year after Hijrah. Okay? The problem is, just from a historical perspective, and I'm going to give you my opinion, Allah knows best. Okay, and I tend to the scholars who say that this was sometime before the actual 9th year, and maybe right before Fatih Makkah. The problem is that Allat and Al-Uzza were destroyed in the 8th year after Hijrah. So it wouldn't make sense that this took place in Am al-Wufud, in the 9th year after Hijrah, considering the conversation, the nature of the conversation that the Imam is having with his people. So when we take all these narrations together, this conversation with Imam happened later on in Medina, but not quite at the time of Am al-Wufud, not quite at the year of the delegation. Wallahu ta'ala a'lam. Obviously the lessons we take from this hadith more than anything else, it starts off with the fard. You start off with the fard, you start off with the mandatory things to come close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Don't miss out on your obligations. And then increase in your nawafil, increase in your voluntary prayers and fasting, and so on and so forth. And that will cover you, inshaAllah ta'ala, for your inevitable deficiencies. Wallahu ta'ala a'lam. Questions? Yeah.
Shaykh, the ayah that tells about the types of sadaqat to put on and sadaqat al-masakin and fuqara. All the stuff that's in the ayah that your zakah is applicable to?
The categories of zakah are in Surah At-Tawbah.
That's the one?
Yeah.
Okay.
The 7 categories of zakah.
That's the one I'm thinking of. Okay.
Yeah. Any sisters? Yeah.
I'm curious to know if, when we were talking about patching up deeds, is it then understood that, for example, one has to have nawafil salawat to patch up salawat? You can't use fasting to patch up your salah, and zakat to patch.
Prayer for prayer, fasting for fasting, umrah for hajj, right? So all these things. And istighfar patches up everything, right? So istighfar in the general sense. Istighfar ba'd al-amal. Okay, so seeking forgiveness from Allah after your prayer, after your fasting, after your hajj, so on and so forth. That's also a patch up. That's also a means of making up for the deficiencies within those things. But there is an intended, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala intends something from you with each one of those ibadat uniquely, right? There's a unique intention, objective to be realized. So if I did not realize it in my fard prayer, then hopefully I'll realize it in my nafil prayer, and so on and so forth with zakah and sadaqah and Ramadan and other deeds as well. And hopefully if I realize it in my nafil prayer, then I'll fix my fard as well. So it's the connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the unique connection to Allah that each one of those deeds presents, that we're supposed to try to take advantage of, inshallah. Allahu a'lam. Yes?
The question of the salah is not going to be asked on the grave, like the day of judgment.
The question of salah? In your grave, the question you'll be asked first is, Man Rabbuk, who is your Lord? But if you did not pray, then you won't know how to answer that question. So that's where we find the issue. That's where the Prophet ﷺ mentions a person would say ha ha, ha ha, laughing hysterically. You know, when you're in fear and you laugh hysterically. So a person wouldn't know how to answer Man Rabbuk, who is your Lord, if they did not pray properly, if they did not hold on to their prayers. So you're not asked about your deeds you're not asked about your deeds in the grave yet. The hisab comes on the Day of Judgment, where you're actually asked and scrutinized for your deeds. That comes on the Day of Judgment. And the first deeds to be scrutinized, or the first of the deeds to be scrutinized, is your prayer. Allahu Akbar. Jazakumullah khair. Adam?
Have you reconciled the hadith of there's actually in the Day of Judgment what God will be asked is the blood, or the blood that will the blood that you stole?
Okay, so how do we reconcile the hadith of the first thing you'll be asked about on the Day of Judgment being prayer, and another hadith where the Prophet ﷺ says the first thing you'll be asked about is the blood that you spilled? The Day of Judgment, the hisab of the Day of Judgment is divided into the rights of Allah and the rights of the people. So the first of the rights of Allah you'll be asked about are the prayer, and the first of the rights of the people are murder and spilling blood, violation of a Jannah. Yeah.
What is, you mentioned Lat,
Al-Lat and Al-Uzza were two idols, two main idols. So there were three. There was Al-Lat. Hubal is the greatest of the idols. Then you have Al-Lat, Al-Uzza, and you have Manat. These were the four main idols that we know of. There were other idols as well, but there's Hubal, and then there's Al-Lat, Al-Uzza, and there's Manat. Yes? Sure. Should we push the kids too much towards the nawafil? I think you obviously should show a lot more leniency with the nawafil. You have to push them towards the fard, right? Towards the obligatory things, especially at the age of 10 years old. And when they hit puberty, and things of that sort, you have to really try to push them. But you don't, it's hard enough sometimes to train them with that. So you have to find a balance, and every kid is different. So it's not like, okay, only make them pray the Fajr Sunnah, but prioritize the nawafil that you do push them to do, and also be lenient with it. Don't make them hate the salah. Don't make them hate the, But it's good to teach your kids to pray Sunnah and stuff like that. That's certainly good. But you just need to know the priorities and know what's becoming too burdensome, and then just as you push yourself gradually, push them gradually as well. Don't try to do it all at one time. Don't have an overnight awesome dream and then tell your kids, okay, from now on we're praying all the sunnahs for every salah, right? But you can push them, especially for the salahs. So it can even be based on convenience, like dhuhr. If they just came back from school and so on and so forth, it's easier to pray the sunnah there. But it is good to get them accustomed to this idea as well. Yes. You promised nawafil to get something done. Did you do that for the Super Bowl? I'll do 20 nawafils if my team wins. Somebody did some great nawafil for the Broncos, right? So actually, the idea of promising good deeds in advance for something of this dunya is actually not a good thing to do at all. Some of the ulama consider it prohibited, completely prohibited. Because you're connecting, that's actually, just the attitude is very much so the attitude of the mushrikeen, right? That we'll do this many tawafs, if you give this, we'll go to this idol, we'll do this. Don't put a number and don't put a specific quantity to it. Because if you do that, what you're implying is that, oh Allah, if you don't give my team this victory, so what if you were a Panthers fan and you offered 20 nawafil, right? Or you said if you let the Panthers win, I'll do 20 nawafil. But the point is that you're implying, you're making your ibadah conditional upon something of this world. Okay, so it's actually not good to promise ibadat. You can internally, so the extra ibadah can come as a result of gratitude that you feel after something that happened. Like alhamdulillah, this happened, so you increase your ibadah as a form of gratitude. But to put like to have those ibadat in advance, it's not a very good thing. All right, I'll take the last question, inshallah, then yeah.
Allah Ta'ala, وَمَا أَتَاكُمُ الرَّسُولُ فَخُذُوهُ وَمَا نَهَاكُمْ عَنْهُ فَانْتَهُوا. How do you make this ayah supposed to be? We follow Muhammad
Sallallahu Alaihi
Wasallam.
Wasallam.
In the hadith that we just follow it because we love it, or we follow it because of we back up the diligency of the follow.
Okay, the word sunnah has many different implications. Okay? Sunnah can mean aqidah, it can mean your creed, it can mean iman. So actually, some of the early books in Islam that were written, as-sunnah, would actually mean it's a book on arkan al-iman. Sunnah can mean in hadith, it means the actions of the Prophet ﷺ, the words of the Prophet ﷺ, so on and so forth. In fiqh, sunnah means mustahab and mandub, something that's recommended. But if you do it, you're rewarded. If you don't do it, you're not punished. So sunnah has a different context. The word sunnah has a different context. The ayah, وَمَا أَتَاكُمُ الرَّسُولُ فَخُذُوهُ وَمَا نَهَاكُمْ عَنْهُ فَانْتَهُوا. This means that the standard is set, that the Prophet ﷺ, that what the Prophet ﷺ says is hukum, it's law. Okay? Nabi ﷺ يقول ألا إنما حرم رسول الله كما حرم الله. Allah, the Prophet ﷺ says that he makes that he says what's halal and haram just as Allah says what's halal and haram. So the point is that the religion is taken from the Quran and from the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. But so there's a difference between denying the 2 rak'ahs before Fajr and not praying the 2 rak'ahs before Fajr. You would be sinful to deny that there are 2 rak'ahs of Sunnah mu'akkadah before Fajr. But who does what? From the Prophet ﷺ. Yeah, so that's the standard. But if you have, so there's a difference between rejecting something out of stubbornness, rejecting something out of kasal, not doing laziness, not doing something, and so on and so forth. So you can't say that a person who does not pray sunnah is sinful. That's the point of this hadith. You can say that a person who denies the sunnah is sinful. But you can't say that a person that's falling short due to their own personal shortcomings is sinful. So that's why that's the point of these ahadith being taken together and so on and so forth.
Is that opinion accepted by all 4 schools, or is there some?
Yeah, so in the Hanafi madhab, there are things that are emphasized to a point of having some degree of an obligatory nature, but they're still not to the point of fard. Like even in the Hanafi school, for example, the 2 rak'ahs before Fajr are not like the fard of Fajr. But they are to a point of being where perpetual neglect is something that's, in fiqh we start to find that perpetual neglect is very much so looked down upon. Not just by the Hanafi school, in fact, but all of the schools look down upon a person insisting on neglect of some of the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. The ayah is in order to follow the Prophet ﷺ, to follow the commands of the Prophet ﷺ, right? But the Prophet ﷺ, there's amr from the Prophet ﷺ, and there are things that the Prophet ﷺ made mustahab. The Prophet ﷺ himself made some things recommended. So you're still following the Prophet ﷺ when you take what he made recommended. But the point is again, your personal application is different from your understanding and your belief. There is belief and there is action, and acting upon your belief and so on and so forth. So when the Prophet ﷺ codified, when he said, those of you who would wish to do this can do this, and the Prophet ﷺ is making something optional. Wallahu ta'ala. Alright, it's gotten very late. Jazakumullahu khairan, subhanakallah wa bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.